Hi, Misha here, and I felt like revisiting the Tomcat today. We can call this a Veterans Day video if you like, but yeah. We've already looked at this model. This is actually the first one released from Hobbymaster. This is a late example. This is an F-14A from the Checkmates. Pretty much as configured towards the end of its service, 2004-2005, when the A was retired. But I have some new models to show you. This one I've had for a bit, just haven't had time to look at. This is the F-14D, known as the Super Tomcat. This is the final major variant. This is as seen 2002-2003 from the Tomcatters. It would have been used early on in the Afghan and even a second Iraq War in this configuration. And then finally, we have the newest one, which I'm going to knock the tarp spot over. This is another F-14A, but it's a little different. This is from the Ghost Riders, circa 1976. So it's very early days of deployment. All three are from Hobbymaster. These two are actually released next to each other in the product line, are relatively new. And while of course the Tomcat has not changed a heck of a lot over the years, the devil's in the details, especially with models. And I have each of these kind of loaded out a little differently, and thought I'd talk more about armament and the variations. I didn't touch on that so much in my first video. So yeah, with that in mind, just to very briefly recap the history of this very famous jet. And back in the 1960s, the U.S. Navy was essentially instructed and forced to take part in the program that resulted in the F-14B. And he really wasn't happy about it. The F-14B was the navalized version of the aardvark, and it was to be a fleet interceptor, meaning going against bombers and perhaps cruise missiles. It was not an air superiority, it was not a dogfighter. Well, by 1966, the Navy was given permission to pursue its own goals, but it was still kept on with the F-14B. But finally, in May of '68, the Congress axed funding for the program, allowing the Navy to go its own way. Incidentally, this also freed the Air Force up to go its own way, which would result in the F-15 and F-16. So both branches are pretty happy not to be tied together, and both were looking to replace the F-4 Phantom. That resulted in the VFX program, and very quickly, 1968, two finalists were selected, McDonnell Douglas and Grumman. Grumman had already been working with General Dynamics on the F-111 and was familiar with it. And so Grumman was selected in 1969, January, to develop their Model 303 into a working prototype. Now, there were no trials, testing. Again, much like what the Air Force had done with the F-15, I think everyone was just tired of politics at this point. So, 1969, 1970, they just went straight into pre-production. And, it was pretty much immediately jumped to the F-14A, which flew in December of 1970, so less than 2 years after it had been selected. Kind of goes to show you what happens when you cut out a lot of the bureaucratic stuff. Of course, there are downsides to that, but that's one of the positives. To be fair, the first 12 were more technically YF-14s, even though they're sometimes lumped in with the F-14A production blocks, and these are pre-production test models. They worked with the design, and by 1973 it was declared to have reached initial operational readiness. And so by 1974, later in that year, around September, these started to replace the F-4 Phantom. They first cruised on USS Enterprise, and this one here, Ghost Riders, they would re-equip, they would retrain with the F-14 Tomcat in 1975 and go aboard USS America, which this model is here. Now, the Tomcat initially was slated for 2 roles. It was to be an interceptor, but unlike the F-111 Aardvark, it was also to be an air superiority fighter, a dogfighter. Now, they had considered making it a... Sorry, my model's wobbling and it's distracting me. They had considered making it have a secondary ground attack role like the Phantom had, but in the end they axed that in 1973, which took the U.S. Marine Corps interest away, and so this was left being a U.S. Navy plane. The only other user was Iran, who in 1976 purchased, well, technically 80, 79 were delivered. So the bulk went to the U.S. Navy. They would get 478 of the A here, delivered through the 70s and into the early 80s. And to fulfill its roles, our loadout. Now, you can configure these. These are pretty versatile. There are a total of 10 hardpoints, but we have some limitations. The 2 hardpoints under the engines are for external drop tanks. That's it. And then we have 2 hardpoints on the glove of each wing for a total of 4. Now, these can carry on the outside hardpoints Sidewinders. That's pretty much it. AIM9 Sidewinders. On the bottom glove hardpoint, we can carry another Sidewinder on each, or we can carry an AIM7 Sparrow. The Sidewinder is a short-range, heat-seeking missile. The Sparrow is a medium-range missile, so both good dogfighting missiles. The center or the bottom glove hardpoints can also carry a Phoenix, an AIM54, which is considered a long-range missile. It's also very big and heavy, about 1,000 pounds each. The fuselage, the flat area under the engine nacelles, known as the pancake, inside it houses a lot of the gear, fuel tanks, the wing sweep mechanism, so on and so forth. But it has kind of a configuration set up. Essentially, it has 4 hardpoints. There are the 2 in the front, and then in the back we can either have 2 side by side, or instead we can have 2 tip to tip. Now if we do the 2 tip to tip, those are typically additional Sparrow missiles. We can also carry 2 Sparrows in the front, and they actually will semi-recess as the back ones will. Or we can put down pallets or rails, and those were for Phoenix. It can carry up to 6 Phoenix, but this was never done because of weight. That's 6,000 pounds, and that's getting, I mean, technically it can carry up to 13,000 pounds, but that's max total everything. Realistically, we're about 8,000 pounds, so yeah, 6 Phoenix, and it's really almost impossible to land one with 6 Phoenix on board. So, for a mission interception, 4 Phoenix would be the most, typically with 2 Sidewinders and 2 Sparrows on the gloves. But even more typical, we would just have 2 Phoenix and either nothing in the back or 1 more Sparrow in the back. And even later on, we would sometimes just have 1 Phoenix with the other missiles. See, the AIM7 and the AIM9 were anti-fighter. The Phoenix, while it could shoot down a fighter, it was mainly designed to go against bombers and cruise missiles. It was heavy, but it was fast, and it had a very long range, over 100 miles. But it wasn't all roses with it. For one thing, it was pretty fickle, required a lot of hours to keep in maintenance. They could wear out. On top of all that, the F-14, kind of learning from the whole Phantom, did have an M61 cannon, and it carried 676 rounds, so pretty impressive. Essentially, super close range, use the cannon, moving out, use the Sidewinder, further out, Sparrow, and then furthest out, Phoenix. But yeah, you could kind of mix and match these. Now you notice there were no air-to-air. Excuse me, air-to-ground. There was just all air-to-air. A few other hard, little points, just so someone doesn't say anything. Of course, we have a 2-person cockpit, pilot and Rio, weapons officer, navigator in the back. The wings will sweep all the way from 68 degrees to 20 degrees. The tail fins the horizontals move entirely. This used the same TF-30 Pratt & Whitney engines as the F-111, which really was the plane's downfall. While it could get over Mach 2.3 and had a max altitude of 50,000 feet, the thrust was only about 34,000 pounds, and it just, considering the whole weight of the aircraft, had all kinds of issues. You had compressor stalls. When loaded up, this had to use afterburners to safely take off from a carrier deck. Performance over 30,000 feet with these engines was subpar. It was a pretty meh engine for this airframe. And the thing is, the Navy knew this even from the beginning, but they had the engine developed. Grumman had already been working with it along with General Dynamics, so it was already kind of anticipated this would be one of the first things to be upgraded. It's worth pointing out that the last 100 or so F-14As produced did have a slightly improved Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engine, but it was far too little. Kind of one of the first major updates to the design came with the TARPS pod in 1981, 82 as these began to be integrated. This was a reconnaissance pod, as the older RF-5 Vigilantes were retired. Some F-14 Tomcats would be utilized as reconnaissance planes, and so they were given this large pod. There would be the 2 Gulf of Sidra incidents in the 1980s, where Tomcats would shoot down a handful of Soviet-designed planes. These would also be used by Iran during their war with Iraq during the 1980s, so they would see some combat. But mostly they were used for, essentially CAP. They were used for air patrol, fleet defense, and of course, in Top Gun. At this point, though, in the 1980s, this is still an air-to-air fighter interceptor. It's what it did. But that would not last for long. Now I'm going to skip over here to this one again and talk about that one. In 1987, the first major update, known as the F-14A Plus, was flown and then started to be delivered. This finally replaced the troublesome Pratt & Whitney engine with a much improved General Electric F-110 or GE 400 engine, which took the thrust from just over 34,000 pounds up to nearly 56,500 pounds. Now this didn't improve the maximum speed, but it improved carrier takeoffs, it improved the ability to carry ordnance, more importantly, it improved the range and endurance and all that good stuff. It made it a better plane, and it fixed a lot of handling issues. So these started to be delivered. They would build 38 new F-14A Pluses, and they would convert about 48 older F-14As, updating the engines. In 1991, the F-14A Plus was redesignated F-14B after the Gulf War, and these were used during the first Gulf War. The Bs were available, or the A Pluses. It was still an air superiority fighter at that time. It was used for reconnaissance, though, with the TARPS pod. It was also used for an escort and just to, fly air patrol to maintain superiority. It wasn't until 1992 that the F-14 was first cleared to drop iron bombs. So this is kind of the beginning of, they see the Cold War is ending. Having a strictly just high-performance air superiority fighter isn't really going to be helpful to the Navy. And anyway, thanks to Dick Cheney and others throughout 1989, all the way through 1994 in Congress, funding was cut. Grumman proposed several new versions and upgrades, but costs. So they reworked the F-14 to finally give it a ground attack ability. Initially, it was just with iron bombs, and it could carry up to 4 using the Phoenix pallets or Phoenix rails under the pancake. And then it would also receive the lantern pod, a single pod, not 2, on the wing glove. And it would still carry 2 AIM9s and usually 2 Sparrows. Typically there would still be one on the other wing, and then there'd be one in the back in the center line. I don't know if I can video it, but it's on this one back here. That would be if we weren't carrying but 2 iron bombs up front. Now the F-14A Plus, F-14B, it had a few new electronic systems like a radar warning system, but it's pretty much the same avionics electronics as the F-14A. But while they were working on the A+, they were also working on the D. So no F-14C, guys. The D was a more radical update, known as the Super Tomcat. It would have essentially the same General Electric upgraded engines, so with the same thrust performance. Be a little heavier aircraft, but it could also carry a little more payload. One thing I forgot to mention, the new engines also allowed much better performance above 30,000 feet, and also allowed for a slightly higher max altitude of about 53,000 feet. So the D would update the avionics. It would also give a new glass cockpit. It would give new multi-displays. It would update the ejection seat. You get the drift. It was a more radical redesign. Thanks to budget cuts, not all that many Ds would be produced. 1991, these started to be delivered. They would build 37 new airframes, and they would upgrade 18 older A airframes. So only about 55 Ds, Super Tomcats, with the final ones delivered in the summer of 1992. So these were too late for the Iraq War. But they would have the lantern pod. they would have more of an emphasis on ground attack. They would work with different bombs, including laser guided, throughout the 1990s, and then in 2001 they would be cleared to deliver paveway and JDAMs and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much where the Tomcat would end its career, would be as a ground attack, ground strike plane. Which, you know, just considering it wasn't originally designed for it, it actually was pretty well suited because it could lift a lot, especially with the new engines. Typically, we would only have 2 laser-guided bombs, though, on the front Phoenix rails. In fact, I don't even think the rears could hold laser-guided munitions, advanced munitions. I think that was just dumb bombs, iron bombs. So this one here, again, it has a Phoenix in the, excuse me, not a Phoenix, Sparrow in the back. This one does have the drop tanks for added fuel and range and loiter. I've got a little bit of a mix of ground ordnance on it, just for fun. This model's pretty neat. It comes with 8 bombs, 4 of them different types you can put on the front pallets, so you can configure it. Now the wings, I should point out the glove hardpoints on even the D and also the B, they can still only carry AIM7 and AIM9s, with the lantern pod being the only real change. And interestingly, even though the plane wasn't designed for lantern, getting it to work was pretty easy. It integrated better than you would think. And the only real issue is early on, if they wanted to use lantern, they could not use tarps. But even that, they kind of made a little bit of a ingenious workaround for eventually. So yeah, production was over by 1992. These would continue in fleet service. The decision was taken in the late 90s to replace the Tomcat with the F-18 Super Hornet. The E would kind of replace it in the fleet defense role, and the F would replace it in the ground, strike role. So its days were already numbered, but these would continue to be used in Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s. The first to go would, of course, be the older A's, and then the B's. Around 2004, they would start to phase these out. D's would fly a little longer, to 2006. The final combat mission was in February of that year, when they would drop some bombs in Iraq. And then in June, you'd have your final carrier takeoff and landings. They had a big official ceremony, last flight in September 22, if memory serves, of 2006. And then that was pretty much it. A few more flights would take place, essentially offloading them from carriers, and be the end of it. These would all be scrapped except for a few sent from museum displays, because of Iran being the only other user that did not want the Iranian Air Force getting a hold of spare parts through espionage. And that's the end of the Tomcat. Kind of the reason I went with a few different models, even though there's not a big difference except for the antennae being a little different on each of these, and a few of the bulbs and modules and whatnot, the paint schemes. I like all the different ways this could be set up. You can tell it's definitely a successor to the F-4 Phantom, because it too is able to carry a wide range and wide style of ordnance. Visually, the only real huge difference between an A and either a B or a D are the engine nozzles, which you probably won't be able to, I will probably won't, but they're smaller and kind of concave on the original A, and then on the D, they're larger, more flared out for the new General Electric engines. Like I said, there's some antennae differences and things, but that's small details. But yeah, I just think it's neat how these can be configured in so many different ways. So I felt like revisiting the Tomcat tonight. Figured I've given the F-15 enough coverage that it's only fair to kind of give its, naval counterpart a little time. A good plane, not a great plane, but it did its job and did it quite well, especially after the B/D upgrades. Once it had a good engine, it really was able to shine and be very effective. Anyway, another reason I have these is I think the F-14 is one of the better Hobby Master models. It's all metal, has moving surfaces, and again, they usually ship these with the range of configurations if you want. Appreciate you tuning in, guys. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you very soon. Next time.